A constant factor that all us speculators look at in the United States is what is going on with the budget. We've got an enormous deficit. I think it's close to $2 trillion again this year. That budget is set by, and the New York Times today has an article on what's going on with the budget cuts. The article says, and I quote, "Budget cuts from were stymied. Congress has blocked moves to scale back." So this, of course, is something that we're thinking about from a speculative standpoint. If on one hand you have significant budget cuts, which would mean that, just to use a number, let's say there's a decline in the deficit from $2 trillion a year to $1.5 trillion a year. This could be helpful to keeping the amount of inflation lower than it otherwise would be. And since 2022, we are back in a cycle where the amount of inflation is significantly higher than what we would like to see. So if we were to get those kind of budget cuts, that would be helpful to saying, all right, we think that that can be a factor keeping inflation lower. On the other hand, if you had budget cuts, that means there's less spending from the government side. And how will that do? Well, all things else being equal, that means the economic growth would be lower because there's less spending from the government. And the impact of that could well be, gee, since the economy is not growing as fast, the financial types will say, oh, well, we therefore think the economy is going to grow or even go into a recession. Therefore, we are very concerned about the stock market in terms of earnings per share, or more important to this speculator, the amount of equity a stock has compared to the price of the stock. And when the amount of stock prices as they are today are very high in terms of price to book value, that in the past has meant, and I think it will mean in the future, the vulnerability to a lower stock market is greater. And so those are factors that we are looking at. I think we just had the fiscal year budget is pretty much passed, with the exception of a couple of the areas where we have a, I guess you'd call it, quasi shutdown in the government, but hopefully that won't last too long. And so from a longer term perspective, we're currently in a situation where if we don't have cuts in the deficit for the upcoming 2027 fiscal year budget negotiations, which are already underway, then that would tend to say, all right, the ability to have a lower inflation, or even to stay at the current inflation, which wasn't that bad at 0.2% for January's CPI, will be difficult. And you'll tend to have more inflation, and these are the kind of factors we're looking at, and we like to say we'll be getting into more detail on that matter at our Substack channel. If you want a copy of my book, The Speculator's Mosaic, just check below, or it can also be bought on Amazon.